From today, we're going to start living with my parents. Since they are my own parents, there shouldn't be any issues, right? However, this was a completely unexpected suggestion from my husband. He hadn't dropped any hints beforehand, so his sudden proposal took me completely by surprise. I stood there, in shock, on the verge of tears, unable to believe what I was hearing. This abrupt shift came just days after the funeral of my father, who had passed away following a prolonged illness. Even though we had just said our final goodbyes, and the chaotic emotions of the funeral were still fresh, my husband seemed to disregard my grief. Without considering my feelings, he decided we would move out of our home. To my astonishment, he chose as our new residence a villa left to me by my father. When we arrived, I found that my in-laws had already moved in. My name is Victoria, and I am 29 years old. I work as a product designer and have recently established my own business. It's been 5 years since Matthew and I got married and began our life together. My career is flourishing, and I am recognized in my field. Financially, I am doing well enough to own our apartment. My mother passed away during my college years, and last year, my father was diagnosed with malignant cancer. He fought bravely, undergoing treatment as the disease progressed to its final stages. Our family doctor had advised us to mentally prepare for the worst. Since moving out on my own, I had always been in close touch with my dad. He meant the world to me, and his illness was a heavy blow. Watching him deteriorate day by day was agonizing, and I often found myself lying awake at night, filled with worry and anxiety. My husband frequently asked about my father's condition, but his concern never seemed sincere. It felt like he was merely waiting for the inevitable, perhaps because of the underlying financial implications. Throughout our relationship, my husband often felt inferior because I earned more than he did. Instead of celebrating my accomplishments, he competed with me, showing a childish side that thrived on rivalry rather than support. In these challenging times, I had hoped for his encouragement and understanding. Yet, here we were, moved into a space that should have been a sanctuary to mourn and remember my father, but instead felt like a battleground of emotions and unsaid expectations, and situations where he felt in control. My father often told me not to worry about him and to focus on my marriage. However, I believed it was crucial to visit him while we still had the chance, to avoid any regrets later. As time passed, I found it increasingly difficult to hide my growing frustration with my husband. During our early days of marriage, his love felt genuine, and our moments together were filled with joy. But his insensitive comments about my father's illness became unbearable. By the time I noticed the change, the kind and loving husband I once knew had transformed, and I struggled to accept this new version of him. My husband worked from home, and although I also planned to work from home after starting my own business, he claimed that having someone around was too distracting. So, I rented a small office space and began commuting. The hospital where my father was treated was on my route, making it easy for me to visit. However, my husband stayed at home all day and left all the household chores to me. Balancing work, caring for my father, and managing the house left me exhausted. Each day, I returned to find the mess my husband had created and the dishes he used left untouched. He lived selfishly, completely ignoring how I felt. Living with him opened my eyes to his lack of empathy, and I felt a profound sense of loneliness. Then, my father passed away. We had sold our family home after discussing it with him. Even as I busied myself with the funeral preparations, my husband seemed distracted, often on the phone or disappearing altogether. "Matthew, please help me, especially now," I pleaded. But just then, his phone rang. After ending the call, he laughed, saying, "I've been getting so many work calls." Inside, my anger and disappointment towards him deepened. Perhaps losing my father so suddenly made these feelings even stronger. His demeanor became colder, and I felt an overwhelming sadness. On the day of the funeral, he spent a long time talking to his parents away from everyone else. When they returned, they were smirking, and their behavior drew suspicious glances from other attendees, making me feel even more isolated. Despite this, the cremation, interment, and inheritance procedures went smoothly, and the funeral concluded successfully. After my father's passing, my husband casually suggested, "Let's move in with my parents starting today. They are my parents, so it shouldn't be a problem, right? If you don't agree, maybe we should consider getting divorced." He said it with a laugh, but I couldn't remain calm after hearing his unreasonable proposal, especially in the midst of my grief. How can we live together? We don't have any spare rooms in this apartment, do we? I challenged him. In reality, one room in our apartment was used as an office and to store my husband's work materials. Since we didn't have children, he used this room quite freely. "It's that villa you inherited," he replied with a smile. I was taken aback. While we had sold the family home, the villa was a special place dear to both my father and me, filled with cherished memories. I intended to keep it as a tribute to him. However, my husband seemed indifferent to my sentiments and continued to push his own desires. "I hope you understand that living in that villa would be very hard for me," I tried to explain, but he appeared not to listen. His parents had already terminated their apartment lease and decided to move into the villa. It seemed they had planned their move during my father's funeral, drawn by the villa's spaciousness and its peaceful location. Their relocation was already underway, and I felt my objections would be futile. Whenever I expressed my feelings, my husband openly showed his annoyance. "You always think about yourself. You've been away from home so much due to your father's illness and those sudden emergency calls. Do you realize how much I've tolerated because of your obsession with your father?" His words were harsh and uncaring, darkening my world further. "Now that your father has passed, you should listen to me," he continued. "It took him a whole year to die, which was way too long." His cold, heartless remarks filled me with shock. I didn't want to believe that this was the real nature of my husband, but it was becoming painfully clear. He had little respect for both my father and me. I remembered the pained expressions on my father's face as he lay on the narrow hospital bed. My father would never have wanted to leave his only daughter behind to merely obey her husband's insensitive demands. My husband's lack of empathy was disheartening, and I felt increasingly isolated in my grief and my fight to preserve my father's memory. At that moment, I felt my affection for my husband completely dissipate. My heart tightened as I thought about his apparent joy over acquiring the villa during a time I should have been mourning my father's passing. Despite the turmoil within, I kept my emotions in check and warned him, "You can try living in the villa, but don't come to regret this decision later." He seemed resolute, so I reluctantly agreed to his plan. Packing only a few essentials, I left our home. My husband looked puzzled at my scant belongings, but all I said was, "I'll come back for the rest later." Honestly, I had no desire to speak another word to him. It was painful to face my in-laws, who seemed to have eagerly anticipated my father's death and were now moving into the villa with glee. I followed my husband in silence. The one thing I couldn't reconcile with was the thought of my cherished place falling prey to his caprices. The villa, technically a single-family home by the sea, is situated in an ordinary neighborhood yet remains conveniently accessible from the city center. Its land is highly valuable. As we exited the station, the familiar scenery of my childhood unfolded before me. Back then, my mother was still alive, and I remember how my father would carry me on his back all the way home after I'd fallen asleep during a train ride. When we arrived at the villa, my in-laws were already inside. Suspicion gnawed at me. It seemed my husband had secretly taken the key and, unbeknownst to me, given a duplicate to his parents. This realization heightened my unease. The stealthy manner in which my in-laws had planned their move into the villa without consulting anyone only deepened my distrust. As I looked around, I saw the gleam of anticipation in my in-laws' eyes as they envisioned their new life in our family home. The villa, filled with sturdy furniture my father had carefully chosen and eclectic European-style furnishings likely chosen by my mother, held a sentimental value they seemed oblivious to. "What a lovely villa, isn't it perfect? Goodbye to living in that cramped apartment. It's such a blessing that we get to live here from now on," they exclaimed. The view from the second floor is indeed stunning. I couldn't help but remember my father's discreet pride in this special place, a sharp contrast to the insensitive excitement of my in-laws. In the midst of their excitement about inheriting what they called a marvelous house of secrets, my husband and his parents' ecstatic remarks only added to my irritation. They seemed to completely overlook the emotional weight of my father's passing, treating the villa merely as a luxury property they were fortunate to inherit. Both the location and the house are impeccable. I'm grateful he left us this magnificent villa. We must thank your father, my husband said thoughtlessly, laughing along with his parents as they opened beers to toast their new living arrangement. As I prepared some snacks for them, the cherished memories of times spent with my parents around the dining table felt overshadowed and tainted by the current merriment. I decided to conceal my emotions and endure through the night. The next morning was abruptly disrupted by my mother-in-law's shrill scream echoing through the villa, instantly altering the mood. As I rushed to find out what had happened, I found her on the bathroom floor, clutching her foot with a look of panic. The floor just gave way beneath me, she gasped, still breathless from the shock. My husband and father-in-law seemed perplexed. The floor looks fine, you probably just slipped, they suggested casually, dismissing her concerns. They examined the spot she pointed out, but the floorboards were smooth and perfectly aligned. Still, she insisted, I'm sure the floor collapsed. As they continued their superficial check, I intervened. Have you tried stepping on that slightly differently colored part of the floor? I asked. Surprised, they all turned their attention to the area I indicated, stepped forward, pressed down on the discolored section with my skippered foot, and immediately, the floorboard made a clear sound and slightly sank. However, the moment I lifted my foot, it snapped back into place. What was that? They exclaimed in unison. If someone stepped on it unknowingly, they'd surely think the floor had collapsed. See, the floor sinks a bit, it's kind of like a trap, I explained. That's dangerous. Is this house defective? They reacted with newfound concern. Their previous disregard for the villa's sentimental value to me seemed momentarily forgotten as they faced the unexpected reality of its physical imperfections. I calmly explained the situation, and they all stared at me in surprise and skepticism. It's not a defect, I said. My father intentionally installed these features. This house is what you might call a mechanical mansion or a trick house. Why would he do that? They asked, puzzled. Well, my father was a huge enthusiast of ninjas. He spent a lot of time and money on this villa, which was both his pride and joy, and a treasure chest of his creativity. As a child, I often came here while he tweaked the house's mechanisms or installed new ones. That's why the villa is filled with traps and clever mechanisms, a shelf you shouldn't touch, a floorboard that drops when stepped on, a door that only opens following a specific sequence, hidden doors, and even secret rooms. This house is filled with my father's dreams and his inventive spirit, honed over many years. Of course, this place is suited for daily life, for someone like me. Having visited since childhood and taught by my father how to operate all these traps, I have no issues navigating them. It's a different story for my husband and in-laws, who are unfamiliar with it. I did warn you that living in this villa would be difficult. I also told you it's a place filled with my father's memories. My father's extreme interest in ninja-related gadgets was well known among our relatives. The real surprise was that my husband and his parents were unaware of it. At first, my husband claimed he hadn't heard about it, but now he was at a loss for words. My in-laws were equally shocked by this newfound information. Having already canceled our apartment lease, and with nowhere to return to, they pressed my husband on what to do next. In the midst of their confusion, both my father-in-law and husband accidentally triggered another trap, causing them to fall. Seeing the two of them sprawled on the ground, I couldn't help but chuckle. Please, feel free to stay as long as you like, I said, my tone more mocking than genuine. They had been captivated by the luxury of the villa, ignoring my warnings and showing no interest in my father's hobbies. Now, their oversight was coming back to haunt them. Even my explanations about the dangers of the traps seemed to fall on deaf ears. "This isn't a big deal. We'll get used to it," my husband finally responded with a forced confidence. I just smiled knowingly, acknowledging his comment but aware of the steep learning curve they faced living in a house filled with my father's clever but complex contraptions. I told them I would head back to the apartment to prepare for our move. However, in reality, I had no intentions of moving. Instead, I planned to take a few days off to sort through my father's belongings, finding solace in the quiet and the time alone. It allowed me to slowly regain a positive outlook and start planning my new life. Within just 2 days, my husband and in-laws had reached their limit living in the villa. Meanwhile, my father's villa had started to become a minor tourist attraction in the neighborhood. It was regularly featured in local newsletters as the trick mansion nestled within a residential area. Whenever the villa was occupied, curious locals and visitors intrigued by its reputation would come to see the famous house. I remembered times when strangers toured the villa and local children played around it, adding life and vibrancy to the place. My father had listed both the villas and our former home's phone numbers in the newsletters. However, since the family home's number was now inactive, any inquiries would redirect to the villa's number. Thanks to my upbringing, I was proficient in foreign languages, which allowed me to handle calls from international visitors easily. My husband and in-laws, however, struggled with this. They couldn't understand foreign languages and were already overwhelmed by the nerve-wracking lifestyle of avoiding the house's many traps. Exhausted, sleep-deprived, and overwhelmed by the constant barrage of unexpected visitors and challenging phone calls, they stumbled back to the apartment. "Why don't we all just live in this apartment together?" "Think about it," they suggested, desperate to escape the villa. They had eagerly awaited my father's demise to claim the villa, but ironically, they couldn't handle living there for even 2 days. Instead of serving them tea, I handed my husband the divorce papers, which I had already filled out and stamped. "There's no way we can live together. If you understand, just leave quickly," I explained with a deep sigh. I couldn't forgive him for his insensitivity and the way he had disregarded my feelings. Without any discussion or explanation, he had decided we would live with his parents. He had never shared household responsibilities with me before and had comfortably dumped them all on me during our time at the villa. I felt cornered and overwhelmed, yet he seemed completely indifferent to my struggles. As my husband and his parents stood before me in our apartment, I realized I couldn't continue living with someone so selfish. His actions had spoken louder than any promises he could make now. "What happened? You used to love me, right?" he asked, bewildered by my cold demeanor. I couldn't help but scoff at his naive question. "How can you expect me to love someone who secretly wished for my father's death and rejoiced when he passed?" I retorted, my voice firm. Without a hint of regret, I handed him the divorce papers and firmly instructed all 2 of them to leave the apartment. "First of all, this is my apartment. If anyone should leave, it's you," I declared when my husband raised his voice, careless of the disturbance it caused our neighbors. "Victoria, I'll call the police for trespassing if you don't leave quietly. Do you not remember this apartment is under my name?" I reminded him calmly. They fell silent, the gravity of the situation dawning on them. They had depended on me financially and now, without much of their own, they faced a stark reality. Determined to sever ties before they could begin their lengthy persuasions, I watched as they left. Neither my husband nor my in-laws had substantial savings. After being evicted from the apartment and unable to return to the villa, they found themselves in a cheap, low-quality apartment, struggling to make ends meet. The previous apartment was better, they often lamented. Initially, my husband felt guilty and apologized repeatedly. However, over time, his guilt turned to resentment towards his parents. Due to their age, they worked infrequently, and their efforts were short-lived. Eventually, they exhausted their savings and pension. The constant arguments led them to become estranged as a family. The walls of their new apartment were thin, barely containing their daily disputes. Even when they received noise complaints, they never apologized. Instead, they responded with hostility, making them unpopular with neighbors. It seemed inevitable that they would need to find another place to live soon. My husband, who had previously enjoyed the convenience of working from home, now found himself in a cramped space without a proper workspace. This severely affected his ability to concentrate and, consequently, his reputation and sales suffered. He barely scraped by with a late-night job at a convenience store and was considering taking on multiple part-time jobs to survive. The in-laws, in their moments of clarity, realized that allowing their son to make decisions for them was their biggest mistake. In their frequent arguments, they blamed the villa's traps and each other. "If you had been more responsible, we wouldn't be in this situation. Don't blame me now. She's the one who kept important things secret," they would argue, pointing fingers but never accepting their part in their downfall. After the divorce, my career as a product designer took a significant leap forward. To process the grief of my father's death and the turmoil that followed, I channeled my creativity into designing with a unique twist, incorporating ninja elements inspired by my father's interests. I showcased these designs on social media, where they quickly gained popularity. To my surprise, a major cosmetics company reached out, intrigued by my work. They wanted me to design packaging with an Asian touch, integrating ninja motifs. Embracing this project, I saw it as a way to preserve and honor my father's cherished memories. The project turned out to be a tremendous success, catapulting my career to new heights. I found joy in giving updates at my parents' graves, telling them about my achievements and how their legacy continued to inspire my work. I decided to keep the villa, transforming it into a mechanical house, a special place filled with memories of my father. I organized tour schedules and made slight modifications to turn it into a safe space where tourists and local children could explore and enjoy for free. Soon, the house attracted significant media attention. The income from this exposure was invaluable, helping to cover ongoing costs. Additionally, online articles about the house were translated into various languages, drawing support from international fans, including some elderly enthusiasts who shared my father's passion for ninjas. I dedicated myself to the ongoing upkeep of this magical place. The mechanical house became a hub of daily activity, especially popular among local children. "Is this the legendary mechanical house I've heard about? Where are the tricks? Show us," they would ask excitedly. With the help of local volunteers, we took precautions to ensure everyone could play safely. Foreign tourists were particularly fascinated by features like the hidden floorboard and secret doors. "Wow, this is amazing. I'm so moved to experience such a unique place. What other tricks are here?" they often exclaimed. Although I lost my father and the inheritance of the villa led to my divorce, I feel the gains have been far greater than the losses. The villa has transformed into a memory-rich location that I now share with family, friends, and visitors. It has also spurred a personal transformation, helping me move forward with renewed optimism and hope.